Before we get started with all the topics, for the few people that haven't seen the first episodes, for the few people that haven't come across your content, maybe give them some background of who you are and especially why you're excited about Bitcoin, and maybe also why you're excited about Bitcoin mining.
Sure. So I'm Bob Burnett. I am the CEO of a company called Barefoot Mining, and we specialize in what I call wild horse mining, but probably easy to think about it more as off-grid mining in small to medium-sized commercial sites. And I probably can get in more detail about what that means. My background's in technology, spent most of my career in the personal computer industry, especially in the 90s and 2000s. I worked for a company called Gateway, where I was a chief technical officer. And even before that, in the 80s, I was an engineer working on a lot of the very early PC designs. And been in Bitcoin since 2017. I kind of look at Bitcoin as, interestingly, I think a logical step from the personal computer. And I think a lot of people don't really probably grasp what the personal computer really was. So the personal computer was the decentralization of computing power. So prior to the personal computer, running a piece of software was a permissioned system. You had to go to something very akin to a banker or a central banker and ask for permission to run your software. And they might say no, by the way. And it was not a guarantee that you would get access to it. And the personal computer meant that now each individual, hundreds of millions, billions of people, now had the ability to do whatever they wanted with the computing power. And it was really the enabling step to the internet, which was the decentralization of information. But without the personal computer, the first step, you don't get the second step, right? And now Bitcoin is I think the third step in this kind of, you could almost think about it as the Holy Trinity, the decentralization of computing power, the decentralization of information, and now the decentralization of money. And that I think that's what ultimately changes the world, right? These three things change everything.
That's super interesting. I think maybe you're actually the first guest that brought it up, that it kind of starts with the personal computer, because that's where the entry device comes in and the internet comes after that, not the internet coming before that. That's a really interesting angle.
Yeah. I mean, I'm old. Part of that is because I'm old. You probably haven't had as many people on as old as me, but also because I came from the personal computer. And, it was very interesting. If we look at the early part of my career, so I have a degree in computer engineering, and I started working with personal computers in the late 70s, actually. There were, prior to the IBM PC, there were all these different platforms from companies like Commodore and Amiga and these kind of computers, but there was no standard. Each was independent, and the IBM PC was really the coalescing point of creating a standard, much like the Bitcoin protocol. The IBM PC set the protocol for the personal computer and allowed this thing to proliferate. But at the time, like coming out of school with a degree in computer engineering, I came out in 1986. What was interesting was my desire at the time, like most engineers, was to work for a big company, to work with IBM or Digital Equipment Corporation or a company like this, and work on the big supercomputers and the mainframes of the time, as we called them. I didn't get that opportunity, though, interestingly, and thank God, right? Because what I did get was an opportunity with what we would essentially call a startup doing personal computer work, designing very early personal computers. And because that industry was in its infancy, none of the senior engineers wanted to work on that technology at the time. It was all junior guys. And that ended up being such a blessing to me, because I got opportunities to work and develop this technology that I wouldn't have gotten had I gone into the kind of the bigger corporations. But it became quickly apparent to me, this thing that we just talked about, that, hey, I actually am in the right spot, that we're going to eat them. We talk about Bitcoin eating fiat. It became very obvious as soon as I immersed myself just a little bit in the personal computer that we were going to eat the mainframe computer, that computing power was the term we would use was moving to the edge. That's how we would categorize it at the time. So if you think about centralized computing power inside a mainframe computer or a supercomputer, it's kind of in the middle. And now what we're saying is, no, the power moves to the edge, meaning all the individual computers. And that's, by the way, where like Metcalfe's law. Are you familiar with Metcalfe's law, Robin?
We've talked about it 2-3 times, especially with the power law. It comes up quite a few times, but
Okay.
I think it's important to still mention it, what it is, because I'm sure there's always someone in the audience that like haven't heard about it.
So Metcalfe's law came from the personal computer, and so it was people looking at the early days of networking computers together, and Metcalfe, I think his name was Bob Metcalfe, came up with the concept that the power of a network was equivalent or scales based on the square of the number of users of the network. So the basic concept is, if you look at a cell phone as an example, if I'm the only person with a cell phone, the user network is 1, the network has 0 value. Now the moment you come in and there's 2 people with cell phones, now the network has doubled. Well, it now has power. It makes the second one. But when a third person comes in, it's growing by the square of that number. So we went from a one squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9. So you can see the progression, right? Like how quickly, when you have 10 people in a cell phone network or any network, now it's a power of 100 relative to just one person in the network. And so it's the same way. It was the same with the personal computer and networking, but it's also true with Bitcoin. Like, we need users, right? We need more people. The economy has to have people, and as the economy has more people, then the network becomes more powerful.
It's a super interesting thing where we talk about social media, we talk about internet adoption, we talk about personal computer, and all those things kind of have the same networking effects. If you're the only one having Facebook, it's pretty much worthless. It's a blank website at that point. But if 4 billion people are on there, it's one of the most valuable companies on earth. And the same with like all the other technologies. Do you see similarities between like the internet adoption, the personal computer adoption, all and Bitcoin adoption in terms of like speed, resistance, challenges, and all those things, because you have lived through all of them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I might answer it slightly differently than you asked, if it's okay. But I think I've started working a bit on a book, and I'll give you a glimpse of the book that I'm working on, because it's the relationship of this very thing we talked about. So a lot of people are familiar with this technology adoption curve, and what it shows is, it's a, if I can describe it to people, it's a bell curve. And in any new thing, it doesn't matter if it's a cell phone or the internet or Bitcoin or whatever, it goes through stages. And the first stage is usually dominated by what are called the innovators. So there are people living at the bleeding edge. They're usually very technologically oriented people. And for them, it's usually about the technology, whatever that technology is. This was true in the personal computer. Because in the early days of the personal computer, let's say in 1985 or 1987, they actually didn't do that much. You had to write the software yourself to make it do something useful often. And they were cantankerous. They didn't work that well. They locked up. They would stop working. They would do weird things. But to the innovator, this first group of people, that was actually appealing. And the most people won't understand this, but it's like fixing it and making it work is actually part of what makes it thrilling. So if it worked perfectly, it would be less interesting to the innovator, is another way to say it. Like if you, like Luke Dasher, Luke is, I'm on the board of directors at Ocean. And I was once watching an early interview of Luke, who was a very early developer involved with Bitcoin. And when the interviewer asked him why he liked Bitcoin, his answer was, because it's very interesting technology. So, and you'll find this if you talk to a lot of the like real OG kind of people. That's how they started. Now, most of them have changed, and now they're interested in kind of the impact it can have on the world and the monetary aspects of it. That's not what drew them in. So anyway, the innovators are the first phase of it, and we must have the innovators, but they represent maybe 1% of the total available market. And the next group is called the early adopters. Maybe it's 3 to 5% of the population. They're people that love new technology, but they don't want to debug it completely, although they're willing to work with some idiosyncrasies. These would be people maybe using personal computers in the late 80s to early 90s. This would be before Windows was prevalent, before Windows worked well, before the networks worked well. But there was some software out there. There were early spreadsheets and word processing and things like that that were useful. And the early adopters used it. And sometimes their computer might lock up or do something strange, and they would get frustrated, but they were willing to live with it. The next group is called the early majority. And the early majority will require the new technology to be useful. They don't want to play. Like they need it to do something. They also need an early adopter to recommend it. So what you'll find is the early majority always has a friend or somebody in their social circle that's an early adopter, and they hold their hand through it. And I think we're in this transition between the early adopters of Bitcoin. I think we look at we talk in Bitcoin classes a lot, right? So the people from 2009 to maybe 2012 or so, they were almost all innovators. I think the people from 2012 to maybe 2020 were all early adopters, or largely early adopters. And we started bringing in some of the early majority, but we haven't really broken through yet. To be honest, we haven't broken through yet. We still, it's still too difficult to use, like the self-custody aspects and those sort of things. And to the degree we're getting the early majority, we're getting it now through things like the ETFs and proxy stocks and things like that. But Bitcoin must make this leap between really the early adopter and the early majority to really break through. And then on the back half of that is the majority. Like that's where the biggest group sits. So the reason I'm going through this is every technology must go through this curve. And a lot of times technologies get stuck. They don't make, it's called Crossing the Chasm. There's a great book actually by that name. And a lot of times a technology doesn't cross the chasm. I'll use an example like 3D printing. So it's been around for a long, long time. It has little niche uses, but it never really made it to the early majority stage, and maybe it never will. Because in the early days when we would talk about 3D printing, I'm going back like 20, 25 years now, the thought was every home in the world would have its own 3D printer, and you'd be making everything from your cups and plates to your toothbrush to your, whatever, all these things, you would just make them inside your house. That was the that was the vision, and it never happened. The technology adoption stagnated, and I think it was because we never solved that technology never solved the problems well enough and cost effectively enough for the early majority to come in. So Bitcoin needs to do this. Bitcoin needs to make this transition. I think it will, but that's our next hurdle.
It's interesting because I'm very young. I'm 26 years old. So my first time ever using a computer was Windows XP. I don't know which computer, by the way. I have no clue which computer this was, but it was a Windows XP machine. And my homepage was already Google. So I grew up knowing Google and was kind of, I don't know, I was born in 1998, so right before the dot-com bubble. Actually, I'm almost as old as Google. I'm in the 9th of September, and I think Google has been founded at like 16th of September in the same year. So that's kind of where I am at. And my first time opening the computer with Google, I think that was probably around 2005, 2006. I mean, when I was like 7 or 8 years old, something like that. And this is already, I would presume, the early majority or late,
We're in the late majority by that
late
point.
majority already. Yeah. So when you compare it to that, are we like before the dot-com bubble still, where like there's a lot of use cases still, but it's like we before I even was born, like before 1998, or it's kind of hard to say exactly, but like where would you put that?
Okay, so let me just give you some history of the personal. So the personal computer was MS-DOS based, so no graphical user interface at all. So 1984 when the IBM PC was created till about 1991 was the pre-graphical user interface era. Okay, so then about 1991, Windows 3.1 came out. There were versions of Windows before that, but they were terrible, so nobody used them. So with Windows 3.1, we started to see the transition to the GUI, to the graphical user interface, and it was okay. And by the way, about the same time, we started to see not the internet come out, but we started to see platforms like America Online, which was a wall, we called it a walled garden site, where you could get news and information and sports scores and stock tickers and have little community chat rooms and all that. That was coming up in that same period. So we started to, I would say we broke out of that innovator phase there, and we went into the early adopter phase in 91. And then, but it was still quirky. But in 1995, Windows came out, Microsoft came out with a product called Windows 95. And it was a major breakthrough with the usability at that point. And we pretty much, by that point, completely eliminated the use of MS-DOS. And so everybody would, when their computer would turn on, it would go directly into the graphical user interface, and all the programs were designed to run that way. Windows XP, which you mentioned, happened, I believe, 2 or 3 years later. I think it was 97 or 98. And what it did was it brought a lot of the business tools to Windows, especially on the back end side. So now connecting to networks and security and these sort of things that were important at the corporate level came into vogue. You could argue we haven't really changed, and that kind of moved us into the kind of the middle of the majority. The late early majority and the early late majority was what was going on there. And by the way, by that time, like my company in that time period, Gateway, which was the company I worked for, in the year 2000, we were the 5th biggest personal computer company in the world. We were making 10 million PCs per year as the 5th biggest. So the total market was well over 100 million PCs a year at that time period. So just to, put it in context, and meaning if you add up all the previous years, we probably had 500 million personal computers in play by roughly the time you were born. It was at that level of penetration. So where are we with Bitcoin? Well, I think we're in the early 90s period still. We haven't hit Windows 95 yet. We are still primarily early adopters with some very early adopters in. So we have a long way to go.
Thank you for watching this video. This was only a snippet of the podcast, and if you want to watch the full episode and get all of the context of this episode, you can click right here or here. Oh, maybe also here.